Hey guys, welcome back to Pawn Dojo. This is going to be our third episode on the tactics series, and today I'm going to be focusing on German tactics, namely Zwischenzug, which means an in-between move, and Zugzwang, which means translates roughly to a move in a tight position. And you'll see how those definitions are actually closely related to what the tactics actually mean and how they work. Before we jump right into it, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy our content and comment down below if you have any suggestions, and we'd really appreciate the support. But with that aside, let's jump right into it. So, first of all, what exactly is Zwischenzug? Well, first, before we talk about that, I want to mention the idea of tempo or tempi, which is a term that's going to be very prevalent in learning chess. Basically, what tempo is time in terms of chess and chess moves. Basically, you're playing a move that comes with a threat or comes with an attack, which thereby creates an initiative. Um, and therefore, in an in-between move, you're actually trying to gain tempi. And basically, the idea of the in-between move is that when your opponent threatens something in your position, you attack something of equal or higher value in their position to create an initiative. Now, it sounds abstract, but I'm going to give you an example from an opening that I think is going to best represent this, and hopefully this will give a better understanding of how this works. So we're going to jump right into an Italian here, classic opening, and then white plays a very principled move c3 with the idea of expanding in the center, one of the main opening principles that we mentioned in a previous video. And here black now develops pretty naturally, putting pressure on the e4 pawn and attacking it. And here, one example of an in-between move is the move d4. Now white could play d3 and be a little bit more passive, and this is a very popular idea, very popular opening, where you just defend the pawn and you play slowly, but if you want to play quickly, play aggressively, you can strike with d4. And this is the idea of an in-between move. Well, here, black originally thought, well, I'm attacking the pawn, so now white has to react to it, right? White has to defend the pawn. Well, as long as white can attack a piece of equal or higher value, he doesn't necessarily have to respond to this threat. In this case, white is actually attacking the bishop. Bishop has a higher value here, so if the knight were to take the pawn, well, you win a bishop, so you win a piece and the game. So here after d4, black has to respond. And now white takes, then again attacking this bishop here. And now here, black also plays a tempo move. This is not an in-between move, but a move that comes with tempo, the move bishop b4 check. Now if the bishop were to drop back, the problem is that white can keep playing moves with tempo, attacking the knight, kicking the knight back, pushing this pawn, attacking the knight, kicking the knight away. And notice how these pawns are just so far in the black position that it actually cramps the black position down to a losing position. This is completely lost for black actually, just because of the space disadvantage. So as a result of that, black has to play bishop b4 check, playing moves with tempo, sidestepping this attack on the bishop and at the same time giving a check, forcing white to be passive, and now black actually regains the initiative because they were playing moves with tempo. They can take this pawn, and after white castles, black can take this pawn here and then play d5. And now they're playing another move with tempo, and they're getting ready to develop another piece and get castled early. So this is kind of the idea of playing moves with tempo, and this is an early introduction to how in-between moves work. In this specific line, you don't actually have to take this pawn back. Surprisingly, a more common move is this crazy move e5. But the point is that you're attacking the knight while black is attacking your pawn. You're temporarily down a pawn, but the knight is under attack. So the knight seemingly has to move, but where to? Like if the knight were to move here, the problem is you're running into a lot of problems with the bishop becoming very active. You're giving white too many tempi. So you cannot give white too much time. If you give them too much time, they're going to start attacking very rapidly. They're going to castle very early. And in the meantime, black's king is not castled yet. So in this case, black plays another in-between move and probably the most significant one of this opening, the move d5. And this is a great move because here while white attacks the knight, black counterattacks the bishop. So as you can see, you don't have to respond to this threat right away, but instead you play an in-between move. You're playing the move in between the threat. So now you're the one that's actually counter striking here. So if white were to take, you can take. If takes, then rook has to move. Again, this move came with tempo, so the rook had to respond. But now you have two pawns here that are really far in the white position, and this one's about to become a pass pawn here, and it's getting ready to promote down the board. This rook is ready to take this pawn, and it's a very dangerous position actually for white, and this is winning. Too many disadvantages here, the pawns, and this pawn's under attack, and black is actually more developed than white, which is interesting. So this is kind of what I wanted to go over in this opening and giving you an early idea, an early introduction to how in-between moves actually work. Now, I'm going to jump into some puzzles to give examples of how to utilize the Zwischenzug in your own games. It'll come up more often than you may think. But it's relatively hidden because you have to kind of see the threat of the opponent's threat and then counter it with a stronger threat. So in this case here, black just played the move c6. And now I would like you to take some time. You can pause the video. I'll give you a couple seconds to do that while you try and find the winning combination for white. So here, first thing to notice is probably this king's really weird positioning. The king's kind of weak here, and that's because black hasn't castled either side. And therefore, a lot of the pieces can actually create attacks against the king. So hopefully you may have seen this, but the idea is that the bishop would want to take this pawn. The pawn, by the way, is attacking the queen. So if the queen were to move, black kind of just accomplished what they wanted, and black can actually castle here, which is, it's great for black now because black is up a bunch of material there, up a rook here, well, up in exchange, a rook for a knight, which is a very good position for black. So instead, white would really like to take this pawn, but the knight's in the way. So here, is there a way we can move the knight out of the way and then go and take that pawn? Because if we could, then we'd be winning because this is a huge threat, right? And it turns out there is a way to do that. Knight takes f6, check. And in this case, it's funny because it's actually a fork, which forces black to take this way, or else they lose the queen. And now that the knight is not here anymore, the bishop is not blocked anymore. And now we get this pin. And so the idea that whenever you see a move, don't instinctively think to just respond to it. There are some ideas hidden in the position, like in this case, the bishop was lurking, and it was prepared to just get rid of the threat and win material, or win the game in this case. If the queen takes, it's going to be even worse than that. You're going to win the rook because of the fork. So this is a relatively easier Zwischenzug puzzle, and this is actually going to be a pretty advanced one. This is actually from a game between Tartakovsky and Capablanca, two chess legends in 1924. And here Capablanca is playing as black. His opponent Tartakovsky just took the knight on b8. Here, again, take some time to think about this position, try and come up with a move or a sequence of moves that you think is going to be the best continuation for black. It's not actually going to be a straight set of moves that seems like you're winning material or going to checkmate. It's not like that in this position. You're just trying to find the best move for black, and it is based off of an in-between move kind of idea. So give you some time to pause the video and try it out. So here, Tartakovsky's idea was actually quite interesting. He was very tricky here. The point is that the king is a little bit weak because it's not castled yet. So if the bishop were to take here, now the idea is to give this check. And if black were to respond right away, now they're actually losing because of this fork, right? And notice, by the way, how like forks and pins are coming up a lot, even in this just this Zwischenzug video, because all the kinds of tactics, they kind of come together in all sorts of games, and so that's why it's so important to practice them, because you're going to see them in your games, and the more you practice those patterns, the more you see them, the better you're going to get at them. So in this case, black cannot respond straight away or else they're going to lose the bishop. So what do they do exactly? Well, Capablanca here actually kind of set a counter trap, which is very interesting. He plays the move, the brilliant move knight d5, which seemingly doesn't do anything, but if you take another look at the position, the knight's actually threatening to fork the king and the queen. But at the same time, the knight is actually defending the bishop. So if you think about it, if you were to give black another move, well, black's going to take that. Well, in this case, you have to deal with the threat of the fork, right? So if knight here, you would win the queen. So let's say king f2, and after rook takes, as you can see here, the queen can't really give this check anymore because, well, the bishop is defended now by the knight, which is great for Capablanca. But at the same time, how look at how white had to respond to the threat of the fork, right? There's no good way to do this. If the bishop came back to f4 here, there's another line, but before I jump into that, queen c1 here could be actually very bad here because after takes again, there's no check or anything. That could be very dangerous. And now the king is just wide open. On the other hand, black is actually ready to castle here, which is a great position for black because white's king is about to get mated soon. Because the queen and the knight and the bishop are all kind of pointing towards the king. They're kind of ready to swarm. And here, after knight d5, if king f2, the same thing could happen. In this case, it could be even worse, actually, because there's these checks all over the place. And the last thing I wanted to show was that after knight d5, bishop f4 is a move. And the idea is that after takes, you still have this fork. But the problem is that black can actually play this incredible move, queen f6, creating a pin on the bishop before taking it. And now you can take with the queen. And so in this case, if g3, then you're able to play g5 and win the bishop back. And well, there's really nothing else you can do to try and defend this bishop because it's attacked twice, right? So this was a brilliant idea by Capablanca to get himself in a better position to move knight d5, in between move, not responding to the bishop capture straight away. So that's the Zwischenzug. I'm going to move on now to what I probably think is a more difficult kind of tactic, which is called Zugzwang. Now Zugzwang, like I said, the definition in German kind of translates to roughly a move in a tight position. Now, what does that mean? Basically, what Zugzwang is you're playing to make your opponent actually run out of moves. So it's usually going to happen in the endgame because there's not going to be many pieces left for your opponent, and if there aren't many pieces left, there aren't going to be as many moves left for your opponent. And you'll see this come into play with the puzzles here. There's some really bizarre stuff that can happen with Zugzwang, and I wanted to showcase that with an example here. It is black to move here. It looks like it's a draw because both sides have pawns. It's clearly an endgame, right? Now, what's important to notice is that this pawn can be targeted by the black king. And here, it actually, interestingly, doesn't matter where you go, as long as you step towards the pawn. This is actually a very interesting example. The white king now has run out of moves, actually. No matter where they go, it's actually a bad position. Because if it was for white, what they would prefer is if they didn't even have the move. They don't want to move here as white. They want to keep their king on g2 where it defends the pawn. But white has to move. Well, they can't move these pawns, so they have to move the king. Well, they can't move the king up because the pawn's guarding that square. And they can't move the king over here because the king's guarding that square. So what does that mean? Well, that means the king is forced to step away from the pawn. And that means now we get into a position where this is a winning endgame because you're going to be up 2 pawns, or even 1 pawn is enough here. So this is a great example of what Zugzwang does. In this case, if you were to not do anything, well, white's going to step and try to block and shoulder off the king here. A lot of Zugzwang positions you're going to see are where the king, or where your king actually shoulders the opponent's king away from the defense of the pawn, and in this case away from the base of the pawn structure. So that was an example of how Zugzwang works, and just for fun I wanted to show this really crazy example from a game between Nigel Short and Garry Kasparov. Garry Kasparov is probably one of the, if not the most, the best chess player in history. And Nigel Short is also one of the chess legends of the of Garry Kasparov's like generation, or actually after his generation a little bit. But here Kasparov is playing as black, and this is actually based off of a very interesting endgame, which is that if these pawns weren't here, um, just it seems like black is winning, right? Because they have the bishop and the pawn here, they're up a piece. But what's important is that this square is actually, this promotion square is actually the opposite colored bishop, opposite color as the bishop. And you'll see why this is important in this case here. If it were black to move, by the way, this would be stalemate. So this, if black wants to try and win, that's not how you do it. If black were to move the pawn, as long as the king stays in this corner here, like this, there is nothing that black can do at the very end. After this check, the king moves, and it's actually like stalemate almost no matter where you go. And if the king moves away, the king just steps up. And after the king moves or whatever, the king just steps back. And the king just kind of stays in his little corner here and just doesn't step away from the corner. And as long as he does that, there's no way to win. So this is actually a theoretical draw. People know this kind of by heart. The idea that the promotion square is on the opposite colored square as the bishop, so you can't actually win this endgame. So how did Kasparov win this as black? Well, this is a perfect example of Zugzwang here. By the way, a good way to try and find Zugzwang is by so-called entombing your opponent's pieces, trying to make all of the opponent's pieces run out of moves, except for maybe one piece. And that one piece, if it moves, is going to be a bad move. So in this case, Kasparov plays the great move bishop d3. And the point is that there are no good moves here, because if the king can't move actually. And this is kind of the whole idea of the position, which is that if the pawn were to push, you can actually take this. And now, notice how the pawn is not on the edge of the board, but is instead on this file, on the b file. Now this is actually a winning endgame. All black needs to do is eventually get white into a Zugzwang position. And like eventually the king is going to be able to kind of step closer and closer to the pawn, and yeah, it's going to be a difficult position because this is going to be Zugzwang eventually. The idea that the king can't stay guarding the pawn and then you go and take the pawn. So this is actually a winning endgame. You can't push that pawn. So instead, white actually pushes here because there's no better move. And then black plays the king e1, which is again a shouldering technique, because now the king can't stay where it is. It can't stay on c1, can't come up, can't come back, so it has to come here to b2. The king continues to shoulder here, preventing the white king from coming back and guarding the black king's invasion. Notice how the king is slowly lurking towards the pawns, right? The king comes to a1, this king comes to c2, and now notice how this pawn is under attack. King a2, king c1, and this is actually a very interesting idea, because you would expect after this, you would expect like white needs to play this. No, actually white could move back, and if you were to take the pawn, the problem is that this is actually a draw, because white doesn't need to move the pawn, which is crazy. Like, or in this case, white has to move the pawn, but it's crazy because this is a stalemate. Like all these squares are blocked, so that just happens to be a stalemate. And if the bishop were to take, now this is the wrong file for the pawn, so it's a drawn endgame. So it's actually it's a crazy position where white can actually survive this, because black actually doesn't want to take these pawns. So what Kasparov does instead is king c1, and the idea is that if king a3, then this king comes to b1, and black is actually shouldering the king in the opposite direction. So basically what black wants white to do is move their king eventually somewhere here, for example, like just move the king here, here, and here, just by slowly shouldering the king and then take the pawns. And you'll see what I mean. So if the king were to come here, king here, now you can take. This pawn is guarded. If the king comes here, now you can take. And the problem is that this pawn is rolling and the king cannot catch the pawn in time, which is insane. Like after here, the pawn is not going to be caught, right? The king is one square away. So this was Kasparov's first idea, but there's another secret idea to king c1, which is after king a1, he plays an incredible move, one of the craziest moves I've seen, one of the craziest endgame ideas I've seen, bishop b1. And this is, again, a Zugzwang. The idea that the king can't move, you've entombed it. This pawn can't move because it's blocked, which means this is the only piece that can move. b5 takes, and now this pawn can move. So b4, and then you release the stalemate. Originally, if the king were to move, this would be stalemate, a huge blunder by black, but instead the bishop just comes back. And now this is a winning endgame, because the pawn is on the correct file. So this is a beautiful endgame technique by Kasparov, basically just sending the king over to the corner, and then ultimately stalemating it right in the corner and forcing the pawn to sacrifice itself so that the pawn gets ripped off of this file. The pawn doesn't want to be on this file, it wants to be on the B file. So I thought this would be a very instructive and a very cool example of Zugzwang shown in a real game between two chess legends. Yeah, hopefully this video gives you a better idea of what Zwischenzug and Zugzwang are and how to employ them into your own games. Again, Zwischenzug, you need to find attacks and threats where you are attacking a piece of equal or higher value than your opponent's threat. And for Zugzwang, you want to try and entomb all the pieces without it being stalemate. You want to kind of shoulder. A lot of times, your king can try to shoulder the opponent's king, forcing them to run out of moves. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll continue in the next video for the tactics series. See ya.